Okay, love this passage in Job 38 and verse 4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell if you have understanding. That whole implication is that God's the only one that knows exactly how he made everything. And of course, we can know and trust in what God has said about how he did that. And we read the first couple chapters of Genesis, gives us a pretty accurate description. We'll actually read through first Genesis chapter 1 here, maybe this week, maybe next, just to see exactly how God says things were made. But nobody was back there other than, you didn't see it. You don't know how it happened. Nobody in this world does. And so, as we're looking at evidences, and certainly there are a lot of evidences that show that God is our creator and that he must have made this world and this universe and all the people and creatures that are in it. That is something that is clearly revealed, which we'll look here in just a second again at a couple verses. And the evidence stacks up when you look at that, as well as when you look at the evidences for God's inspired word, which is just one after another after another. We can have confidence that God is our creator. And that's something that everybody should realize. In this whole world, that should be evident, as it says in Romans 1, verse 19. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. God made it obvious. He made it so we could see without much work, actually, evident. Very clear, as this next passage says, verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. No excuse. We weren't there, but we have the evidence. By the things that have been created, we can see there must be a creator, and by the evidence that supports God's word as his word. The Bible is his word. So overwhelming evidence, which we haven't started to look at yet. We've been actually spending our time, these last 7 classes, answering the best arguments evolutionists have for there not being a creator and for things evolving by a accidental process. We've been looking at the best arguments that are put forward. And we're going to do that for maybe just one more class, this class possibly. I don't think we'll be going beyond that. And then we'll look at some very exciting things, evidences for design in this universe that tells us there must be a designer. And for order, like a watch here, we know something about that watch. Somebody organized and put that together by a process. We can make the same conclusion about this world. Purpose, all the things that we see around us and the purpose that every part of our human body has, like the human ear. And then the function. That function is something that requires ingenuity. Someone that can take the design and the purpose and put it together in something that actually works and fulfills a purpose. So we're going to look at all that kind of stuff, and I hope it will be exciting and informative. It's going to be seen that it's just God has made it so clear that he's our creator and that we need to be responsible to him and that we should glorify him for all that we see around us, because it is amazing, amazingly wonderful. Even though some would like us to believe it's all accidental, it certainly is not. It's glorious evidence that we have a creator. Okay, so just looking ahead there a little bit, so if you're wondering, boy, we're still stuck on this evolution and evidences and trying to see whether there's evidence from the evolutionist standpoint. And so we won't be there much longer. Nobody's been complaining, but I'm figuring since we haven't really got into the positive evidences yet, you might be wondering. We'll get there. Okay, where we leave off last week? Well, we finished up, some evidence in the fossil record about the truth about human evolution. It's just not there. Here's a classic quote I think we read last week by Lowenstein. Imaginations run riot in conjuring up an image of our most ancient ancestor, the creature that gave rise to both apes and humans. This ancestor is not apparent in ape or human anatomy, nor in the fossil record, Anatomy and the fossil record cannot be relied upon for evolutionary lineages. Yet paleontologists, those that study fossils, persist in doing just this. Look, we're not giving up our argument, even if there is no evidence for it. It's basically what's being done in all the evolutionary circles. Okay, and then in general, I think we looked over maybe about 25 or 30 quotes about just the general truth about transitional fossils. Are there fossils, transitional fossils in the fossil record? And really, there are not. And here, just to read this quote again, this general one here by Eldridge. The observation that species are amazingly conservative and static entities throughout long periods of time has all the qualities of the emperor's new clothes. If you remember that little story, everyone knew it, but preferred to ignore it. Paleontologists, faced with a recalcitrant record, obstinately refusing to yield Darwin's prediction pattern, simply look the other way. We're not giving up. We know we don't have evidence, but not letting anybody else know that. So that's kind of, we'll finish with that here and get on to our last, well, next to last, point about the fossil record. And remember, the whole point there is, if evolution is true, we should be seeing many, many transitional fossils from joining one type to another type through the history of time in the geological record. We don't see that. And we especially don't see it in one very crucial place, and that is in something that's called the Cambrian Explosion. Okay, we'll look at that just for a few minutes here this morning. Look at all those different creatures there we've got that just all of a sudden appeared on the scene, supposedly many million years ago, but basically in the lowest strata that has any kind of creatures preserved in it. All these things appear at once. And so you've got here a chart that I know you can't see very clear from there, but you get the idea. This is the evolutionist idea of how things evolve over time. Down at the bottom, some 4 billion years ago, the Earth cooled off, and then life came into existence by accident, and then slowly evolved through different stages through millions of years until we get up to you and me and all the animals and creatures and plants that exist today. So this is their general description of how things happened. And we've been talking about these things as far as the fossil record goes for the last number of weeks. Well, down here at the bottom, see that little wiggly circle? Is the Cambrian level, they call it, the Cambrian fossil layer. And in that layer, there aren't just down at the bottom where the first life appears, nothing below this level, wherever you go, except some microbes and algae, basically is what you find below this. And yet at this level, there's all sorts of amazing creatures, a number of which still exist today. There's things like, let me see here in my notes, jellyfish and sea anemones and worms and fish and tube worms, sponges, mollusks, horseshoe crabs, snails, on and on, things that exist today, as well as a number of many things that have been extinct. They're all at this lowest layer in the rocks in the earth called the Cambrian level. So here's the question, or here's the point, is that below this layer there should be millions of years of fossils that precede these amazingly complex creatures, but nobody can find anything. And that's a problem. And let's just see what kind of a problem it is. Here's H.S. Ladd, renowned evolutionist, biologist. He says, most paleontologists today give little thought to fossiliferous rocks older than the Cambrian, thus ignoring the most important missing link of all. Indeed, the missing Precambrian record cannot properly be described as a link, for it is in reality about 9/10 of the chain of life, the first 9/10. In other words, we should see more at the Cambrian and below than we see from the Cambrian up to today, because of these life forms going back again. I mean, it's just amazing. This is just one picture, are just amazingly complex and diverse, all different kinds of creatures. that by the theory of evolution should have taken many multitudes of millions of years to form. Why can't you find any links below? You don't find anything below that. Okay, and again, we're letting evolutionists basically string themselves up. Here's what we're doing. They're the ones who are coming out and admitting, we have a problem. We can't find any of these transitional fossils before all these amazing creatures came on the scene. And of course, that's got to make you think, something's wrong here with this theory. Axelrod. One of the major unsolved problems of geology and evolution is the occurrence of diversified multicellular marine invertebrates in lower Cambrian rocks on all the continents and their absence on all the continents and their absence in rocks of greater age. I didn't read that very well. We got the Cambrian level. We see signs of it all over the world, but nothing, everywhere you go, nothing below that. Charles Darwin, he's the guy that made this whole theory popular. Some people think he came up with it. He didn't. He just wrote about it a lot and wrote a book about it that became very popular and accepted among a lot of scientists. He says, consequently, if the theory be true, that is my theory of evolution here, it is indisputable that before the lowest Cambrian stratum was deposited, long periods elapsed, as long as, or probably far longer than, the whole interval from the Cambrian age to the present day. And that during these vast periods, the world swarmed with living creatures. That's what we should see. To the question why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods prior to the Cambrian system, I can give no satisfactory answer. How about, a good answer would have been, this whole theory I came up with is a fairy tale. That would have been a good answer. May not have sold his book as well, but that would have been it. But my whole theory just falls apart because the greatest extent of where you should see fossils in the world is going to be, that's all totally missing. My theory is wrong. Something else must have happened. Mike. I
think you're taking a very scientific approach to this because what you're doing, no, I'm serious. What you're doing is what true scientists should do.
Yes.
Is that they state a hypothesis and then they work diligently to disprove it. And we see here that again and again evolutionists have disproven evolution and yet they cling to it. And the process is you state a hypothesis, you work to disprove it. If you can't disprove it, then it becomes an established scientific teaching. But of course,
exactly right.
They can't do that.
But here's the thing, Mike. The only other possibility is one we're not willing to accept. God created. And we'll see that in this next couple of quotes. Bill.
Charles Darwin's father and his grandfather both belonged to a society called the Lunar Society. And it was only made up of 6 or 8 men. And the whole idea behind this society was to try to prove the existence of the earth without God. And that influenced Charles Darwin a whole bunch.
Yep.
His theory is just from those guys.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, he didn't come up with it.
It is a fairy tale.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, he's admitting it himself based on the facts. Sam. You're close, okay. Right next to Andrew, he had his hand up. Make you work out here, Nate.
So I'm probably going to be talking about something that you're going to be addressing later.
Okay, I'll tell you.
I mean, the evolutionary science always approach all these different things that you've been showing us as a timeline, right? You have the lowest timeline, which is a long time ago, and then you go out through the million years and it goes up different historical events in these fossils. But that's the evolution science. There's a huge body of geologists, there's a huge body of paleontologists, there's a huge body of biologists that if you search for science that's being found out there, there's a big consistency of them saying this all happened in one event. All this record, bottom to top, was done at one time. So there isn't a historical chart here.
No.
One event buried all of these animals.
Right.
And so,
And what was that?
Cambrian era being the beginning, as you talk about it, can even confuse us sometimes. When a geologist would step up and say, no, they lived at the same time as the top. Right. They all got killed at the same time and buried at the same time.
That's a very good point. Sam is referring to this one big time as being the what? The Noah deluge, the flood, the Genesis flood that killed trillions of creatures or of different kinds all over the world and buried them in sediment at different levels. And that's what they're digging up. But that requires you believe the Bible and the account of the flood. Thanks, Sam. And that's something that we believe. Don't get me wrong, but we're looking at their evidence, which, see, they're saying they've got facts that are evidence for this, which we're saying they don't. And
yeah, so last week I read you a quote from a guy named George Wall that said, I know that these things couldn't spontaneously happen, and yet I believe that it happened because I don't want to believe the other thing. Right? You said there's only two alternatives.
Yes.
There's evolution or God. Well, you threw another alternative in there, which is really evolution of a different kind, but that's panspermia or aliens.
Yeah.
Right? And so what these people are, that's why it's such it's becoming more and more popular to think that, and I've even seen it in movies, that some aliens came here and brought life with them, and that's why it all happened in the Cambrian era, because that they seeded the earth with life, they terraformed it or whatever, and that's the reason that's gaining more popularity, because they still refuse to believe in God.
right, exactly. I don't think we'll go into panspermia on this class. We'd be here for months and months and months, but which is the theory, that it was seeded from a different star system. Unless you really want me to go into that one, but I think for now. But that's an explanation some evolutionists believe. Very few, but some do. And it's getting more and more popular. The more sci-fi movies come out, the more young people buy into it. I think it's fun to play with. Mike.
And I don't know if you're going to get into this either.
I don't either.
The geological column consisting of different layers, and what it takes for sediment to form into layers and how that's not a gradual period, but it's something that's characteristic of a rapidly laid sediment. So, that they settle out, they separate due to different weight and so on, and form these different layers within the geologic column.
We're not going to get into that, but and there's a lot of information on that too that experts have looked into. And who's the guy that you like, Sam? Don Patton has an excellent series on a lot of that geological information, and he is an expert on that. And you can get a hold of that material, and we probably won't go into that though. I'm not saying it wouldn't be worth it, but yeah, Mike.
I would just like to also inform people of a gentleman named Walt Brown, who is a PhD in physics and geology, and he has a book that's available completely online, or you can buy it. It's called In the Beginning. Very simple. Okay. In the Beginning by Walt Brown. And like I said, you can read the whole book. Yeah. And he talks about that a lot too.
Okay. You don't make any money off that, do you?
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, I know he does. I'm kidding with you. Okay, getting into the point that a couple of you made about this whole thing about the only other conclusion is you've got to say there's a God, but people don't want to say that. Here's the most popular evolutionist, we mentioned him before, of our age, Richard Dawkins, so well published and interviewed all the time. And here's what he has to say about this problem of the Cambrian fossils. He says, it is as though they, the fossils, were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. See the smile on my face? Both schools of thought, punctualists and gradualists, despise so-called scientific creationists equally. Now stop there for a minute, don't get confused here. What we've been looking at is what 95% of evolutionists believe. Slow, gradual process of change that should have whole bunches of transitional species, which they're not in the fossil record. There's another small group, 5% of evolutionists, punctualists. And we're gonna look at that just for a few minutes, just so you know what's out there, who believes something a little bit different. But he says, right, for this point, both people who believe evolution happened slowly and those who feel like it happened overnight, basically, despise so-called scientific creationists equally, and both agree that the major gaps are real, that they are true imperfections in the fossil record. We don't have any transition species anywhere because the fossil record has just so many gaps. Okay, which we've shown really is not the case, but we're not going to go back at that. But a little further, what Dawkins says here in the same book, he says the only alternative explanation of the sudden appearance of so many complex animal types in the Cambrian area is divine creation, and we both reject this alternative. And this is exactly what Mike was describing. If you made up your mind it can only be one way and you're not open to the evidence that would suggest otherwise, you're going to reject it, even when you have something as convincing as no fossils below the Cambrian level, which you have to have if the theory is true. So, understand, people come at this whole theory with preconceived ideas and motives. And that happens a lot in the study of things, religious things as well, as scientific things are, well, this is both scientific and religious. Okay, a few more things here. J Gould, the most famous such burst, he's talking about different bursts in the fossil record. The Cambrian Explosion marks the inception of modern multicellular life. Within just a few million years, nearly every major kind of animal anatomy appears in the fossil record for the first time. The Precambrian record is now sufficiently good that the old rationale about undiscovered sequences of smoothly transitional forms will no longer wash. He's saying, basically, look, Dawkins, we've had plenty of time, and we've unearthed plenty of strata to find out if there's anything below that Cambrian level, and there's not. Peter Douglas Ward, the seemingly sudden appearance of skeletonized life has been one of the most perplexing puzzles of the fossil record. How is it that animals as complex as trilobites and brachiopods could spring forth so suddenly, completely formed, without a trace of their ancestors in the underlying strata? If ever there was evidence suggesting divine creation, surely the Precambrian and Cambrian transition known from numerous localities across the face of the earth is it. See, at least this guy is being forthright and considering, this is a huge evidence for creationists here, and we don't have an answer for it. Finally, on this, Douglas Futuma, organisms either appeared on the earth fully developed or they did not. If they did not, they must have developed through pre-existing species by some process of modification. If they did appear in a fully developed state, they must indeed have been created by some omnipotent intelligence. Amen. And that is what the evidence of the fossil record supports, is they came into existence suddenly. Not only as if they were created, but because they were created by an omnipotent God, a loving, wonderful God, who, as you get into things much more deeper and important, gave his own son that we could have life everlasting. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful truth that we're looking at here. Okay, so this Cambrian explosion, all this stuff that just boomed at once is a huge evidence that there are no transitional fossils either during the whole era of time from the beginning till, or at the very beginning of the fossil record. Just doesn't exist. Any questions before we move on? Okay. couple more things before we get on to the positive evidence. You remember that punctualist? Evolutionists that don't believe in the gradual forming. They believe in something different. We'll look at that for a minute. You need to remember this word, punctuated equilibrium. Actually, don't remember that. Remember the hopeful monster, because that's much easier to remember. And it's exactly what the theory suggests, is that the reason we don't find all these fossils of transitions is because it happened all of a sudden, very quickly, and the fossil process couldn't capture enough of the possibilities of these transitions. Richard Goldsmith was one of the original proponents of this theory, a German evolutionist, geneticist, who in 1936 became professor of zoology at the University of California, Berkeley. Sharp guy. You don't become this kind of a position without having a lot of class and clout. He said simply, the first bird hatched from a reptilian egg. And so you got this little guy coming up, just because, you know, mom one day hatched a chicken instead of a reptile. Honest, that's what they say. Or something very close to this we'll look at. So and why does he say this? Tell me why he's suggesting this. Because the fossil record shows no transitions that would support gradual evolution. So rather than believe in God, it must have happened just like that. Reptile, just something happened to the chromosomes in there, and boom, there comes a chicken or a bird of some kind. more like this, possibly. Randy, don't look so concerned. This isn't a real creature here, all right? You're looking a little worried back there. Okay, this is just an artist's conception, but in big, huge stages is what the theory actually he describes as happening. So Goldsmith, yeah, I like that guy. That's pretty cool. Make a neat pet. Yeah, I know, that's right. He says, Goldsmith goes on, the hopeful monster is one of the means of macro or large evolution by single large steps. This is what they believe. Why do they believe this? You got to hold on to that. Because there's no evidence of evolution, transitions in the fossil record. A monstrosity appearing in a single genetic step might permit the occupation of a new environmental niche and thus produce a new type in one step, or a few steps, is how they describe. This is science, or what's held as theoretical science. I mean, look at the extremes that people go to. You can understand why there's only 5% of the evolutionist community. I'm surprised there's 5% that hold on to this, but they do, and for good reason they do. Andrew.
Well, two things. First of all, there are no fossils of animals like that.
Of course not. There's a reason why there's no fossils of animals like that. Yeah. Because it happened like that.
That's right. And now I forgot what the second
I'm
was,
sorry.
But no, it's okay. Sorry, I forgot.
You come back. We'll come back to you. Well, we're on this point for a little while longer. Okay. Golds, you got it? Okay. You get older, you know, your mind kind of.
I know. So let's just say that your dinosaur there gave birth to a bird. That's only one. Where's the female or the male?
There's a million problems with this theory, other than the fact that
you'd have to have multiples doing it at the same time with
yeah.
the same creature, and then they'd have to find each other.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, there were 2 eggs then.
Yeah.
And one was a boy and one was a girl.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't buy it. The odds of that are even more than evolution.
No, you're exactly right. You see that huge problem you have on the side of the main problem, which is how does this going to happen to begin with? Mike.
Yeah, they would sooner believe that a reptile could give birth to a bird than to believe that an intelligent God could send his son and a virgin could give birth to the Son of God, you know. And that's not a hopeful monster, that's a hopeful savior.
That's exactly right.
It just, there's so many problems with this that it requires more faith than
it does.
Believing in God's word ever has required. more blind faith, I should say. Absolutely blind faith.
It's amazing to what extent people will go to, scientific minds will go to come up with a solution to this problem that they've got with the fossil record, rather than admit there's a God, which is what the evidence is pointing to. Okay, Goldsmith, he said, species in the higher categories originate in single macroevolutionary, large evolutionary steps as completely new genetic systems. The genetical process which is involved consists of a repatterning of the chromosomes, which results in a new genetic system. This repatterning of chromosomes, you've heard of chromosomes, it's genetic material. He comes up with this vague idea. It wasn't long until it was discovered that chromosomes don't work this way at all, and they can't just reposition themselves. They do vary some within a certain chrome pool, but that's it, chromosome pool, and that's all that happens. It can't do something like this, and it was admitted that just couldn't happen. Still, other very prominent evolutionists, here's one, Stephen J. Gould, we've heard a few quotes from him. Now look at this guy, professor of geology and biology and the history of science at Harvard University. This is no small person. This guy is renowned worldwide for what he is. And the creator of the invertebrate paleontology at the Museum of Comparative Zoology. This guy is monumental as far as his influence. And he says, as a Darwinian, I wish to defend Goldsmith's postulate that macroevolution is not simply microevolution extrapolated, and that major structural transitions can occur rapidly without a smooth series of intermediate stages. Sharp guy, gives no evidence for this, but the point is, why is this guy willing to concede this? Because in all his years of studying this in the paleontology, he sees there's no transition. And he's come out and written a lot about that. But this is what he's forced to conclude. Of course, he's not forced to conclude this, but if you're not going to believe in God, you're forced to conclude this. He goes on to say, speciation, the process of macroevolution, large step evolution, is a process of branching, and this branching is so rapid in geological translation, thousands of years at most, compared with the millions of years that most evolutionists believe, for the duration of most fossil species. And so it comes up with this kind of a chart that describes this is how this 5% of these evolutionists believe things happen. Not a gradual process of change, transition, that you should have all these fossil transition things, but it happens so quickly, punctuated. Boom, a few thousand years. There was something in the environment that caused these changes, and all these gigantic steps took place. And since it happened like that, well, we just, the fossil record couldn't preserve it because it was too quick. That's the answer that they give. You have to figure out whether that really makes any sense. Most evolutionists don't buy it. I don't buy it. Doesn't make sense to me. Okay, what happened to my little trigger here? Stephen M. Stanley, evolutionists, any claim that natural selection operated with great effect exactly where it was least likely to be documented, in small, localized, transitory populations, would seem to render Darwin's new theory untestable against special creation, and perhaps almost preposterous as a scientific position. And there's a proposition. A lot of other quotes by evolutionists say, come on, you guys are just trying to, explain away something, and of course the creationists who've seen this say, we believe the same thing. You don't have any transitional species, so you've got to come up with a theory like this. Okay, any questions on this? We're going to punch on here. Yeah, Mike.
So this would not only have to be happening in one evolutionary progression at a time. There would be, hundreds of species that are having this same side of punctuated change. So what you look at this,
everything from the first cell that ever accidentally was produced, everything would have to have this
punctuation and
all
stabilization
around, everywhere, and because it happened relatively quickly, we just don't have a record of it in the fossils.
It would be as likely as bombs going off all over the city and developing a new downtown.
Hey, you can give it a try.
I mean, out of those bombs arise new architectural design and style, and the whole thing is transformed by these random. It's just absolutely preposterous.
It is, and that's what mainline evolutionists would agree with you and me. One rare quote from a creationist. You notice I don't give quotes from creationists normally because they have a different viewpoint. But this guy makes a good point here. Oh, no, I'm sorry, this isn't from a creationist. This is still an evolutionist. I just don't want to drag this on too far. Yeah, he's just saying there is no system that we found that could possibly do this. And again, you can go back and get all these quotes anytime you want. Here's the creationist. He says, and this is Michael Denton, major discontinuities simply could not have been crossed in geologically short periods of time through one or two transitional species occupying restricted geographical areas, unless we are to believe in miracles. And that's the point he makes. Surely such transitions must have involved long lineages, including many collateral lines of hundreds or probably thousands of transitional species for everything that's ever existed. I'll throw that in, like you did. Okay, so we don't buy it. So what do you got then? Here's our chart. Remember this chart? This is the evolutionist picture of how things came about. We spent a little bit of time here looking at their evidence for it, seeing it doesn't hold any water. We haven't looked at the seed yet, but I'm going to say it doesn't exist. It didn't come about by accident. We'll look at that further later. The trunk, that's the Cambrian level, the beginning of it all, doesn't exist. They don't have anything below all those multitude of different kinds of animals in that lowest strata. It's just not there. There is no trunk in the fossil record. And as we've studied these last 5 or 6 weeks, no connecting branches. And so what you're left with is the way God created things after their own kind. This is the best evidence. This is the best evidence evolutionists have. And it doesn't hold a drop of water. What you see, as far as what random mutation can do, or what the fossil record shows, is that we all have been wonderfully and fearfully made by a God who's great and awesome. Sam.
You have shown us a lot of their evidences and their greatest evidence so far, but they're still going at it. And the areas that you haven't shown are some of the, what I would think, the most exciting scientific fields that show God's creation and stuff like that, which is in biology and microbiology.
We're going to get into that.
And stuff like that. So, I mean, there is other areas where they're looking for this evidence of this shows how we could evolve, or how a cell could evolve, or look at this, and they're still looking for this evidence, or saying they found this evidence and stuff like that. But what's really exciting is we're finding a lot of amazing evidence towards God's amazing design.
Yeah. And when we're going to take a little time looking at microbiology, because you know why? Because we can. We can now look at the very small world and see something there that if you've never seen it before, you will be amazed at the kind of molecular machines God has made, running all around your body, trillions of them moving all around inside you. Kind of gives you the creeps in a way. So we'll look at some of that. And it's amazing. Couldn't look at that back at the time the Bible was written, but that's okay. They saw plenty of evidence that we'll be looking at as well. But the more time goes on, the more evidence there is that God created all things. Okay, what do we got? A little bit of time. I want to cover this last point so we can start fresh tomorrow. And this is not having to do with the fossil record, and it's called embryological recapitulation. Don't you love these words? I just love it. You'll know what this is in just a second. But this is another branch of evolution, now pretty much discredited completely, but still used in textbooks, so we got to look at it because you may hear about it, and you may have to give an answer for it. What this is this guy by the name of Ernst Haeckel was the biggest proponent. He was a professor of zoology at Jena, Germany, back during this time, and he came up with a series of drawings. Both times he published them in 1866 and 1874, drawings which he claimed illustrated similarities between embryos and comparative stages, and that it was evidence of a common ancestry. So here's his pictures. Now, we'll see in a bit, they're not accurate, but this is what he's drawn. He says, look, here's a fish, here's a salamander, here's a turtle, chicken, rabbit, and a human, and they're almost exactly the same back in their early stages of being an embryo. This has to prove that they came from a common ancestor. Even if his drawings were true, it didn't prove anything. It may prove embryos are similar, but then, when you get that little, and we're talking really little, who knows how God designed things to grow from in the womb? Could be very similar until they grow to be something distinct. Don't know that. But the point is these things, let me go ahead with this, Mike. The point is these things aren't accurate. In fact, that very second time he published this, Professor Hiss in 1874 declared that Ernst Haeckel's drawings were fraudulent and were mere inventions of Haeckel's imagination. And believe me, they're in so many textbooks back through the 50s and 60s that as an evidence for evolution. In 1909, Haeckel was forced to admit that he had falsified some of his drawings and had speculated on their actual appearance. In The Neck of a Giraffe by Francis Hitching, he quotes Haeckel, and here's Haeckel saying, "After this compromising confession of forgery, I should be obliged to consider myself condemned and annihilated. If I had not the consolation of seeing side by side with me in the prisoner's dock hundreds of fellow culprits." He's talking about other of his fellow scientists who've done the same thing. "Among them, many of the most trusted observers and most esteemed biologists," he goes on. "The great majority of all the diagrams in the best biological textbooks, treatises, and journals would incur the same degree the charge of forgery. For all of them are inexact and are more or less doctored, schematicized, and constructed." So he's getting himself off the hook. Yeah, I'm guilty of drawing these things inaccurately and showing something that I believe, but I'm not alone. Everybody does it. Hold on just a second, Mike. Let me get through. Give me a second. Well, go ahead. Mike in there. Go ahead, Mike.
So, I was a science major and had a lot of this stuff jammed down my throat. So I'm not that old. I mean, I'm old, but not that old.
Yeah.
This stuff here was taught in my college class, and we had these very defrauded drawings that were made to deceive us, right, as you pointed out, and still had them in college being taught. Now, that was brought to the attention of one of the champions of evolution, J Gould.
Yeah.
They said, hey, we have proved these aren't the embryos that come from these different animals. And J Gould said this, yeah, we've known that for about 20 years.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, the point is, if you knew it, Mr. Gould, Dr. Gould, then why didn't you have the integrity to say, these are a sham, we need to get them out of the textbooks?
Yeah.
This is perpetrated by people who know better.
Yes. Thank you. Appreciate that. Let me head on with a couple more things. I've only got a couple minutes. Now, in 1997, Michael Richardson, noted embryologist at St. George Hospital Medical School in London, exposed Haeckel's fraud even further with his actual research in embryology. Richardson's research showed that there was very little similarity between the embryos that Haeckel had claimed. You got the fish on the left, the salamander, the turtle, and Haeckel's drawings on the top, but the actual embryos looked completely different than what he illustrated and showed entirely different things. And so he's interviewed in London Times during this particular period by Nigel Hawkes, and he says this is one of the worst cases of scientific fraud. It's shocking to find that somebody one thought was a great scientist was deliberately misleading. It makes me angry. What Haeckel, did was to take a human embryo and copy it, pretending that the salamander and the pig and all the others look the same at the same stage of development. They don't. These are fakes. Surely, he continues, the biogenetic law theory of recapitulation, which is what this is all about, is as dead. Oh, no, I'm sorry, this is somebody else now. Anyway, going back to him, he's just saying, it's all a lie. They made it up. They had something they wanted to prove, even though they didn't have the evidence. Keith S. Thompson says, surely the biogenic law theory of recapitulation is dead as a doornail. It was finally exorcised from biology textbooks in the 50s. As a topic of serious theoretical inquiry, it was extinct in the 20s. It never happened. Never happened. But it was one of the, next to the fossil evidence, it was the most prominent evidence that evolutionists gave. It was all fake. I think that made a little concerning about that, isn't it? That they put that kind of stuff into textbooks and all levels of education. Well, there we go. Time's up. Okay, we'll continue next week. Mike, go ahead. You got a quick question?
No, I just that even if those things were true, even if those pictures were identical, that is trying to prove something simply from the shape of something, which is just about as scientifically valid as trying to prove that there was an elephant in the clouds because you saw something shaped like an elephant. You know,
pretty close.
You know, the substance is something totally different.
That's what I say. Even if it wasn't a fraud, it didn't prove anything. Yeah. Thank you for your attention and participation.